Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we're doing a deep dive into Morgan Housel's really phenomenal work, The Psychology of Money, Timeless Lessons on Wealth, Greed, and Happiness. It's a book that I think fundamentally shifts how we should be perceiving financial success.
It really does, because when most of us think about getting rich, the default perception is that it's a hard science.
Right.
We picture these financial engineers, the quant analysts, the traders with PhDs, all armed with these super complex models and degrees from the best universities. The assumption is just so clear. If you're not a math genius, you're basically set up to fail. That's the system we're told exists.
And that right there is the crisis in perception we want to unpack. Housel argues, and I think he does it brilliantly, that while the math side is important, your actual financial outcomes have less to do with that complex knowledge, what we might call rational optimization. And they have far more to do with how you behave. Money, at its core, is a behavioral and psychological system. It's a world where being reasonable almost always beats being mathematically perfect.
So just to be very clear up front for everyone listening, this is not financial advice. We are definitely not here to give you stock tips or tell you how to optimize a portfolio.
No, not at all.
Our mission today is to really understand the deep systems at play. We're talking about incentives, how our own perception gets distorted, how we think about risk, and just the profound behavioral flaws that are, baked into how we see and chase wealth. It's an exploration of why people, even incredibly smart people, do such ruinous things with their money.
Morgan Housel comes to this topic from a really interesting place. He has deep roots in financial journalism, and he spent years just observing, watching the real-world biases and the systemic flaws that affect how people invest.
So he saw it from the ground up.
Exactly. He saw that it was often way more powerful than any economic theory. So he distilled all those observations into this influential report, which was also called The Psychology of Money, and that became the foundation for this book. He's really trying to capture the core psychological skills you need for financial health.
And his challenge to the entire traditional finance world is, it's simple, but it's also kind of devastating, isn't it?
It is.
He basically says that technical skill is rarely the thing that separates the winners from the losers. Success isn't about complexity. It's about these really simple psychological skills. Patience, knowing what enough means, and having this deep humility about the role of just chance.
And we need that perspective because our culture has this massive, massive tendency to misattribute success. We are obsessed with celebrating skill and intelligence and hard work, but we just fundamentally underestimate, or, a lot of the time we just ignore the huge external forces like luck and risk that define every single outcome.
Okay, so let's unpack that. I think the best way to do it is with the contrast Housel sets up right at the beginning of the book. It really highlights this failure of perception. On one side, you have the archetype of success, right? This wildly brilliant tech executive.
Certified genius.
Yeah, total genius. He was designing patented parts for Wi-Fi routers in his 20s, but for all his intelligence, he was famously reckless. There are these stories of him just being arrogant drunk. He would literally take gold coins out of his safe and skip them across the ocean for fun.
Can you imagine just skipping gold coins into the water?
It's insane. He was technically brilliant, but emotionally and financially just completely out of control, and he eventually fell into total financial disaster.
Now, contrast that staggering recklessness with the very quiet life of a man named Ronald James Reed. If you look him up, his Wikipedia entry just says American philanthropist, investor, janitor, and gas station attendant.
Which is already an amazing combination.
It is. Reed was born in rural Vermont, was the first person in his family to even graduate high school. He worked at a gas station for 25 years, and then he swept floors at JCPenney for another 17 years.
And the details of his life are so important for understanding his success. He bought a pretty modest two-bedroom house for $12,000, and he lived in that same house until he died in 2014. He was 92.
He drove a used Toyota Yaris. His entire lifestyle was the complete opposite of that tech executive's, flamboyant excess.
And yet, when this humble janitor died, he made international headlines. He left $2 million to his stepkids and over $6 million to his local hospital and library.
An $8 million fortune. And as Housel points out, there was no secret here, no lottery win, no big inheritance. He just saved what little he could, invested that money in simple blue-chip stocks, and then he just waited.
For decades.
For decades. He showed this phenomenal patience, allowing compounding to turn these tiny, consistent savings into this absolutely staggering fortune.
This is where the contrast gets so sharp. Because Housel also tells the story of Richard Fuscone. This is a Harvard-educated Merrill Lynch executive. Fuscone was, the picture of professional savvy.
The guy who should have known better.
Exactly. He retired in his 40s to become a philanthropist, but he borrowed heavily to maintain this. Get this, an 18,000 square foot mansion. It had 2 elevators and 2 pools.
Wow, the overhead.
Can you even imagine? His home maintenance alone was reportedly costing him over $90,000
Yeah.
every single month.
That kind of opulence, that kind of leverage, it's just fundamentally incompatible with the reality of market risk. So when the 2008 crisis hit, Fuscone went bankrupt.
Wiped out. His multi-million-dollar luxury home was seized and sold in foreclosure.
So the lesson here is just, it's so stark. And it's where that crisis in perception really hits you. Fuscone was greedy and overconfident. Reed was patient and humble.
And that behavioral difference, patience versus greed, humility versus ego, it completely eclipsed this massive gap in their education, their formal intelligence, and their professional experience.
So when you boil it all down, Housel's central thesis is both simple and incredibly powerful. Financial outcomes are driven more by behavior, psychology, and your personal context than they are by intelligence or formal knowledge. The difference between success and total ruin is often found in these soft skills, these behavioral traits, not in how sophisticated your trading strategy is.
Okay, so if the difference really is behavior,
Yeah.
but I think we have to start by accepting something that feels a bit counterintuitive, which is that what looks like crazy behavior to me might be perfectly reasonable to someone else.
Yes.
When we see someone taking what looks like a crazy risk with their money, our first instinct is to judge them. But Housel's first big idea is that ultimately no one is crazy.
That phrase, no one's crazy, it forces you to acknowledge that every single one of us is operating with a unique, very narrow, and deeply influential personal history with money. Your personal experience of the economy might make up, 0.0000001% of what's ever happened in the world. But for you, that tiny slice accounts for, 80% of how you think the world works and what risks feel okay to take.
That anchoring is so powerful, and it's usually invisible to us. If you grew up during a period of really high inflation, for example, you have this visceral, almost painful view of how unstable cash and bonds can be.
But if you grew up with low, stable prices, inflation probably doesn't even register as a primary concern. It's just not on your radar in the same way.
We can actually see this in the data. Housel cites research that shows people's lifetime investment decisions are heavily anchored to the market experiences they had in their early adult life. So if you were born around 1970, the S&P 500 went up almost tenfold adjusted for inflation during your teens and 20s. You grew up with this built-in belief that stocks are just this surefire, wealth-generating machine.
Right. But if you were born just 20 years earlier, say in 1950, the market went literally nowhere adjusted for inflation during those same crucial formative years of your life.
So you have 2 equally intelligent people, separated only by their birth year, and they go through their whole lives with completely different non-negotiable gut feelings about how stable or how rewarding the stock market is.
And that difference isn't intellectual. It's experiential. It's in your bones.
And that visceral experience matters so much. You can't just study the Great Depression in a history book and truly recreate the emotional scar of living through it.
No, it's the difference between reading a weather report and actually living through a Category 5 hurricane. One is data, the other is trauma. And this leads to these huge systemic misunderstandings across different classes and generations.
I think the most powerful example he gives of this systemic critique is the lottery ticket buyer. Americans spend billions on lottery tickets, and they're often bought disproportionately by low-income individuals.
The very same people who, statistically, often can't come up with $400 in an emergency.
Exactly. So, to a lot of us, especially wealthier people, spending hundreds of dollars a year on a mathematically terrible bet seems insane, maybe even irresponsible.
But Housel really pushes us to try and understand their context. For a low-income household, buying that lottery ticket isn't a rational investment choice based on probability. It's not a spreadsheet decision.
So what is it?
It's paying the small, affordable price for the only tangible dream they have of getting the good stuff. The nice vacations, the safe neighborhoods, sending their kids to college without debt. All the things that other people just take completely for granted.
So from their perspective, it's a perfectly rational trade.
It is. It's a decision that makes perfect sense inside a person's unique and often very constrained context. We have to realize that these financial decisions, they're made at the dinner table, where all your emotional needs and your unique personal history get scrambled together, not in a spreadsheet.
Okay, so once we accept that our own context dictates how we see the world, we have to confront these two huge, unquantifiable factors that often just feel unfair: luck and risk.
Housel describes them as two sides of the same coin. They're doppelgangers. The exact same force, just operating in opposite directions. They're profoundly real, but we constantly ignore them.
Why do we ignore them?
Because they're hard to measure, for one. And honestly, it's culturally awkward to talk about. It feels rude to tell a successful person they just got lucky.
Yeah, that doesn't go over well.
The story of Bill Gates and his childhood friend, Ken Evans, is the perfect illustration of this. Gates achieved this massive one-in-a-million piece of luck just by happening to attend Lakeside School in Seattle.
Which had a computer.
Not just a computer. It had a cutting-edge computer terminal at a time when most universities didn't even have one. This gave him and a few friends this just astronomical head start in the brand new world of computing.
And his friend, Kent Evans, was right there with him. By all accounts, including Gates' own, he was his equally skilled, ambitious, and obsessed partner. They spent countless hours together scheming about their future careers as CEOs. They were total intellectual equals.
But Kent Evans died in a mountaineering accident before he even graduated high school. And mountaineering deaths for high schoolers are statistically very rare, about a 1 in a million risk.
So Gates experienced 1 in a million luck, and Evans experienced 1 in a million risk.
Exactly. The same random external force determined their ultimate outcomes, and it had absolutely nothing to do with their intelligence or their effort.
Wait, okay. If we admit that luck is that powerful, does Housel suggest that effort doesn't matter? Or that we should just stop trying to emulate successful people? I mean, that feels like a really defeatist conclusion.
No, not at all. That's a great question. Housel's point is that the real danger is in ignoring luck. Because when we ignore it, we fall victim to survivorship bias. We look at these extreme successes, like a Warren Buffett or Mark Zuckerberg turning down $1 billion buyout offer from Yahoo back in 2006, and we just assume their success was purely due to genius foresight or some cunning business strategy. We try to derive lessons from these extreme outliers.
But the story could have gone the other way so easily.
Yeah.
How little would things have had to shift for Zuckerberg to be seen as the fool who missed a life-changing payday?
The line between inspiringly bold and foolishly reckless is often a millimeter thick, and crucially, it's only visible with hindsight.
We praise Buffett's skill, but he himself admitted that his foundational investment in Geico, which was critical to his entire fortune, broke almost every diversification rule that his mentor, Benjamin Graham, preached.
So was that a genius move, or was it just luck that the insurance business happened to survive and thrive? It's impossible to tell, and that's the point.
So what's the actionable takeaway here?
Be very careful who you praise and admire. Trying to emulate an extreme outlier is often a fool's errand because you can't reliably repeat or inherit someone else's luck.
So what should we do instead?
Instead, Housel suggests we should look for broad, common patterns of success. Things like maintaining control over your time, being patient, being frugal. These are things that are generally applicable and far more reliable than trying to, say, duplicate Warren Buffett's specific investment strategy from 1965.
Okay, so if the biggest external force is this combination of luck and risk, then what's the biggest internal force, the one that we have some control over?
That would be compounding. And it's the one force our minds are just fundamentally not built to grasp. Our brains are wired for linear thinking, not exponential growth, and it causes us to completely miss the sheer magnitude of its power.
Compounding is so counterintuitive, but it's arguably the single greatest force in finance.
The real-world proof is Warren Buffett. When Housel was writing this book, Buffett's net worth was around $84.5 billion.
And here's the part that just blows my mind. You're telling me that $81.5 billion of that total, which is what, like 99% of it,
Almost all of it.
was accumulated after his mid-60s, after he was already eligible for Social Security.
Precisely. Buffett started investing seriously when he was 10 years old. His success isn't just because he's a phenomenal investor, which he is, but because he's been a phenomenal investor for 3/4 of a century. Longevity, that's the real driver of these absurd financial results.
That one figure just completely redefines what success in investing even means. So let's just run the counterfactual for a second, just to get the scale of this. If Buffett had started later, maybe in his 30s, and then retired at 60.
Which is a very respectable career for an investor.
A great career.
I don't
His
know.
net worth today would be somewhere around $11.9 million.
Not billion? Million.
That difference is staggering.
Yeah.
99.9% of his actual fortune just vanishes.
Longevity is the true driver. You can see this contrast so perfectly when you compare him to Jim Simons, the head of Renaissance Technologies. Simons achieved vastly superior annual returns, an astronomical 66% annually compared to Buffett's very respectable 22%.
And yet Simons is about 75% less rich.
Wow. Because Simons didn't really hit his stride until he was 50. He had less than half the time for compounding to work its magic. His annual performance was way better, but his time horizon was much shorter.
So the big lesson isn't to chase the highest possible annual returns, which usually requires taking on the most skill and the most risk.
No. The key is to simply endure, to stay in the game long enough for the engine of compounding to actually run. If there was a manual for financial success, the most important page would just be blank, except for the title, Shut Up and Wait.
Okay, so if time is the great multiplier, then what's the silent killer of compounding? That brings us back to that crucial behavioral difference we saw in the opening stories, the inability to define enough.
The novelist Joseph Heller once had this great observation. Housel recounts it. He was at a party hosted by a billionaire hedge fund manager with his friend Kurt Vonnegut. And Heller pointed out that their host probably made more money in a single day than Heller had ever made from his masterpiece, Catch-22.
And Vonnegut asks him how that feels.
And Heller replies, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough."
And the danger Housel identifies there is so deep and psychological. It's when the taste of having more increases your ambition faster than your satisfaction. You're just perpetually running on a treadmill.
Every step forward just pushes the goalpost 2 steps ahead. And that compels people to take greater and greater risks to chase a target that's always moving.
Look at the case studies Housel brings up. They're tragic. Rajat Gupta. He was an orphan who rose to become the CEO of McKinsey. He retired in his mid-40s with an estimated net worth of $100 million.
Which is an unimaginable amount of wealth. It could safely generate millions a year in passive income forever.
But Gupta wanted more. He wanted to be in the billionaire circle. So while he was on the board of Goldman Sachs during the 2008 crisis, he learned that Warren Buffett was about to invest $5 billion into the bank to stabilize it.
Huge market-moving news.
16 seconds after he hung up the phone from that board meeting, Gupta called a hedge fund manager and gave him the insider tip.
And that tip immediately translated into $1 million in profit for the person he called. And it ultimately led to Gupta's conviction for insider trading and a prison sentence. It's just an utter tragedy of excess.
He had everything he needed: reputation, freedom, security. And he risked all of it for more money that he absolutely did not need.
The same psychology drove Bernie Madoff. Before the infamous Ponzi scheme, Madoff was a wildly successful, totally legitimate market maker. His legitimate firm was making between $25 and $50 million a year. He was already a pillar of wealth.
And he still pursued the fraud.
As Warren Buffett observed about people who do this, to make money they didn't have and didn't need, they risked what they did have and did need. And that's foolish.
The core warning is just that there are some things, reputation, freedom, your family, your happiness, that are never, ever worth risking, no matter how big the potential financial gain is.
The ability to say no to a potential dollar might be the most crucial financial skill you can learn.
And this inability to stop, to say enough, leads directly to the next foundational idea. The getting wealthy and staying wealthy are 2 completely different skills.
Yes, and they often require opposite temperaments.
Look at the case of Jesse Livermore. He was often called the greatest stock market trader of his day. In the 1929 crash, he shorted the market and made the equivalent of over $3 billion. His skill at getting rich was it was unparalleled.
But just 4 years later, he was completely overwhelmed by his own confidence. He believed he was untouchable, he started making bigger and bigger leveraged bets, and he lost everything. He eventually took his own life.
So he was a genius at getting wealthy, but terrible at staying wealthy.
Exactly. Getting money requires optimism, it requires risk-taking, pushing boundaries. But keeping money demands the complete opposite. It demands humility, a bit of paranoia, frugality, and, critically, accepting that a big chunk of your success might have just been luck, not genius.
Survival and endurance matter more than a flash of brilliance.
Housel really drives this point home with the story of Rick Guerin. He was part of that investing trio with Buffett and Charlie Munger in the early days, and Guerin was intellectually just as sharp as they were, but as Buffett recalled, he was in a hurry.
He was impatient. He used margin loans leverage to try and amplify his gains. So when the market crashed 70% during the 1973-1974 downturn, he got margin calls.
And he was forced to sell his stock at the absolute bottom. It wiped out his chance to ever compound that wealth. He had the intellect to get wealthy, but his impatience destroyed his ability to stay in the game long enough for the big gains to happen.
So if survival is the ultimate financial skill, how do you ensure you can survive?
That's where room for error comes in. It's the necessary insurance policy. It's the shock absorber for your life. The most important part of any financial plan is to just assume that the plan is not going to go according to plan.
This is the idea of a margin of safety, right?
Yeah.
Borrowed from Benjamin Graham.
Exactly. Graham famously summarized its purpose. He said, "The purpose of the margin of safety is to render the forecast unnecessary." You don't need a perfectly accurate forecast if you have enough of a buffer to weather whatever storm the market throws at you.
So that buffer is things like cash reserves, a frugal budget, flexible thinking.
All of it. And room for error isn't about being conservative in the sense of avoiding all risk. It's about increasing your statistical odds of survival so you can stick around long enough to capture those infrequently occurring massive gains, the tails that drive everything in the market.
You have to be okay with regular losses.
You do, because
Right.
failure is just inherent in progress. The U.S. economy is this spectacular success story, but it grew amid 9 major wars, 33 recessions, and a 99.9% failure rate for companies over time. If you are leveraged to the hilt, one of those 33 recessions wipes you out completely.
Which means you miss the growth phase that always follows.
And this is why leveraged debt is the great destroyer of room for error. Taking on debt to amplify your gains pushes these routine, manageable risks into ruinous, catastrophic risks.
Think about a homeowner who was wiped out in 2009 because they had too much leverage. They didn't just lose money, they lost the opportunity to participate in the cheap mortgage rates and the market recovery that happened in 2010. They were taken completely out of the game.
A margin of safety guarantees your ability to get back in the game when those opportunities are ripe.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the distinction between being rich and being wealthy. It's a difference that feels more psychological than financial.
It is. Richness is visible, it's tied to current income, and it's signaled by outward possessions. The designer clothes, the luxury car, the massive home. Wealth, on the other hand, is hidden. Wealth is income that you have not spent.
This is beautifully captured in what he calls the man in the car paradox. When you see someone driving an expensive car, Housel points out, you rarely sit there and admire the driver.
No, you don't even think about them.
You almost instantly just imagine how cool you would look in that car. People spend staggering amounts of money to signal success, but the audience is always internally focused on their own desires, not admiring the person sending the signal.
He makes the point that humility and kindness will get you far more respect than horsepower ever will.
And the irony is just profound. Spending money to show people how much money you have is the absolute fastest way to have less money.
We tend to judge success by what we can see. The Instagram posts, the big houses, but real wealth, the security, the future freedom, that's all invisible. It's the nice cars you didn't purchase, the vacations you deferred, the first-class upgrades you declined. Wealth is financial assets that haven't been converted into visible stuff yet.
Which creates a unique problem for finding role models, right? If you want to learn to be wealthy, you can't really observe it.
Exactly. Ronald Read, the janitor philanthropist, he was only celebrated after he died, when his massive hidden portfolio was finally revealed. While he was alive, his wealth, his savings, his investments, his discipline, it was all invisible. It's impossible to learn by imitation when the true source of success, which is restraint, is fundamentally hidden from view.
So these core individual behaviors, patience, greed, humility, they don't exist in a vacuum. They map onto these larger systems that shape our financial world.
Right.
And they often produce these unpredictable and unstable results.
Right, because the actors within the system are often playing wildly different games, even when they're looking at the same thing.
The whole financial system kind of operates under this illusion that assets have one single, rational, true price that's based on fundamentals. But Housel shows that the price depends entirely on who you are and what your time horizon is. Is the current price of Google stock correct? Well, for a day trader who's looking to sell by lunchtime, the price is purely about momentum and short-term volatility. But for a 30-year saver, the price requires decades of discounted cash flow analysis.
They're both looking at the same stock, but they're playing two completely different games with different rules and different goals.
And this divergence is what leads to systemic instability. Bubbles form when the composition of investors shifts, and the short-term traders who are focused purely on momentum, that's game B, they start setting the marginal price.
And the systemic risk appears when the long-term investors who are playing game A see that rapidly rising price, and they mistakenly believe that the short-term traders know something fundamental that they don't.
You can see this perfectly in the dot-com bubble. Cisco stock hit this insane valuation that implied it would soon be larger than the entire U.S. economy.
Which is just absurd on its face.
Of course. The short-term traders were just riding the momentum, inflating that price. But the long-term investors, confused by the rapid rise, they jumped in. They thought they were applying a long-term strategy to a sound company. But they were buying at prices set by day traders. They were playing the wrong game.
And that led to catastrophic losses for them when the music finally stopped.
So let's talk about incentives. While everyone seems to be focused on maximizing their investment returns, Housel argues that building true wealth relies almost overwhelmingly on one thing: your savings rate.
And your savings rate is primarily determined by the gap between your ego and your income.
That's a great way to put it. The ego-income gap.
Past a certain income level, the most powerful way to increase your savings isn't to try and raise your income by another 10%, which often involves taking on more career risk or working punishing hours. It's far more effective and often easier to just raise your humility and reduce your spending.
Saving money is a daily struggle against that instinct to constantly, extend your peacock feathers to signal status to your peers.
And crucially, the primary incentive for building wealth isn't really to buy more stuff. The true incentive is independence and flexibility. Savings provide this unseen return.
What do you mean by that?
It's the ability to wait. It's the option to quit a job you hate. It's the freedom to change careers, or the leverage to pounce on an investment opportunity when other people who don't have cash reserves are being forced into these desperate, ill-timed sales.
That flexibility is priceless.
Especially in a world where complexity and uncertainty are only going up.
And this entire system is constantly being driven by stories over statistics. Our perception of the economy can change in an instant, even when the tangible assets are exactly the same.
Housel has this great thought experiment. He says to imagine an alien observing New York City in 2007 and then again in 2009. The buildings, the factories, the computers, the patents, they were all the same. In fact, technology had arguably gotten a little better. More smartphones.
Yet, in 2009, the U.S. household net worth had plummeted by $16 trillion, and 10 million more Americans were unemployed.
The only thing that fundamentally changed was the collective story we told ourselves. The narrative about the stability of housing and the prudence of bankers, it just broke. And that sudden collapse of a shared belief is what created the economic damage. It's a potent, self-inflicted psychological force.
This craving for a coherent story also explains why we're so prone to believing what he calls appealing fictions. When the stakes are high, like you're fearing a crash or you're facing insolvency, people are willing to believe just about anything that promises predictability, even if the odds are terrible.
This illusion of control is so persistent. We desperately want a controllable, predictable world, so we cling to these authoritative-sounding forecasts, even when history proves over and over again that the world is overwhelmingly surprising.
We're fighting a failure of imagination, not a failure of analysis.
Yes. The Stanford professor Scott Sagan has a quote that perfectly captures this. Things that have never happened before happen all the time. We use history as a map for the future, but Housel argues history is merely a guide to where people went wrong in the past. We have to prepare for the unexpected.
The Fukushima nuclear reactor is a perfect example. It was built to withstand the worst past historical earthquake. It failed to imagine a worse one for which there was no precedent.
And the most dangerous yet least recognized system that Housel maps is this sociological feedback loop that was created by post-war American expectations. He calls it the big stretch.
Okay, what's the big stretch?
After World War II, the main economic goal in the U.S. was to prevent another Great Depression. So the government deliberately kept interest rates low to finance war debt, and it launched programs like the GI Bill and this massive expansion of consumer credit.
And that fueled an explosion of housing, car purchases.
Yeah.
A whole new consumer culture was born.
The result was this highly egalitarian period from about 1950 to 1980. Income inequality shrank dramatically. The country got rich by making the poor less poor. Lifestyles leveled out.
People were watching the same 3 TV channels, driving cars that were only minorly different. You measured your well-being against peers who were fundamentally similar to you. There was this subconscious sense of lifestyle parity.
But since the 1980s, rising income inequality started to change that landscape. A small group, the hedge fund managers, the tech executives, they pulled dramatically away in terms of their wealth and their visible lifestyle, buying multi-million-dollar homes and super yachts.
And here's the key mechanism of the feedback loop. The majority of people, fueled by that expectation of parity that was set by their parents' generation, and now amplified intensely by the internet and social media, they still feel subconsciously entitled to that high-end lifestyle, even though their median wages have been flat for decades.
And that psychological dissonance is what triggers the big stretch. People take on massive amounts of debt, huge mortgages, maxed out credit cards, longer car loans, to try and maintain a visible lifestyle parity that no longer exists in reality.
They're trying to fit a rapidly inflating ego into a stagnating income stream.
Exactly. And this destructive mechanism is what produced the instability of 2008, where household debt to income ballooned from 60% in the early 70s to over 130% by 2007, often disproportionately hitting the lower and middle income groups who were just trying to keep up.
So all of these deep psychological insights have these profound present-day implications for our own financial lives and also for how we interpret the broader markets.
Absolutely. Let's start with personal finance. Academic finance is constantly chasing the mathematically optimal strategy, the rational strategy. You plug numbers into a model, it spits out the perfect choice.
But Housel forces us to confront the reality that people don't seek perfect math. We seek the strategies that maximizes how well we sleep at night, the reasonable strategy.
You see this perfectly with the example of Harry Markowitz. He's the Nobel laureate who developed modern portfolio theory. He literally wrote the textbook on rational portfolio construction.
And when he was asked how he invested his own money,
he admitted he split his funds 50-50 between bonds and equities to minimize my future regret. His goal was emotional stability, not maximizing his returns. He chose the reasonable path over the rational one.
and that validates choices that might seem irrational on paper. For instance, investing in individual stocks or favoring local companies, this home bias, it's not mathematically optimal because of diversification risk.
But if that familiarity gives you the necessary emotional connection and commitment to stick with your overall long-term investment strategy during the inevitable market downturns, then it's perfectly reasonable.
Because the ability to stay in the game is the most important variable.
It is the greatest variable correlated to long-term performance.
And what about how we view market bubbles and crashes? Most investors see volatility and crashes as a kind of punishment, a fine. It means they did something wrong or they should have been smarter.
Right, but Housel stresses that volatility is actually the fee, not the fine, for achieving long-term market returns. It's the unavoidable cost of admission to the theater of compounding.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average returned a spectacular 11% annually from 1950 to 2019. But Housel notes that during that time, the market traded at least 5% below its previous all-time high, 40% of the time.
That dread, that uncertainty, that moment when you wonder if everything is collapsing, that's the price you pay for the ticket.
And what happens if you try to avoid the fee? If you try to, steal the car, so to speak, by timing the market or using accounting tricks to smooth out your returns, like GE did under Jack Welch.
You usually end up paying double later on. GE's short-term manipulation gave them smooth, predictable returns temporarily, but the hidden costs eventually surfaced as these mammoth losses and the destruction of shareholder value.
So the key is to convince yourself psychologically that the market's fee is worth the long-term payoff. When volatility hits, you have to recognize it not as a signal to panic and sell, but as the necessary unpleasant cost of engaging in the greatest wealth-generating mechanism the world has ever invented.
And in the current age, that man-in-the-car paradox is just turbocharged by social media. It amplifies that psychological treadmill Housel describes.
Outward appearances, Instagram filters, elaborate trips, massive houses, they become the main metric by which we judge financial success.
So we're constantly comparing our unspent, invisible wealth, our cash savings, our retirement accounts, our flexibility, to someone else's curated visible richness, which is really just their spending.
And that comparison is just inherently destructive. It leads to perpetual dissatisfaction because we never see the cost or the debt or the future security that might have been sacrificed for that one visible display.
This just fuels the continuation of the big stretch for debt even among high earners. We're constantly reminded of the highest ends of the lifestyle distribution, And it creates this psychological entitlement that prevents us from ever feeling like we have enough.
If we want to be wealthy, we have to learn to be okay with appearing less rich than we actually are.
And finally, we have to fundamentally recognize that failure is statistically normal. It's necessary, and it's often inevitable. This is the concept that tails drive everything. A tiny minority of events, or people, or companies account for the majority of all results, both good and bad.
The data on this is just shocking. JP Morgan Asset Management found that 40% of all public companies in the Russell 3000 index lost at least 70% of their value and never recovered.
Catastrophic loss is the norm, not the exception, yet the index itself has soared 73-fold since 1980.
The implication of that is profound. It means the overwhelming majority of your individual decisions might be wrong, and that's okay. The 7% of companies that performed extremely well were more than enough to offset the vast majority of failures.
So we often misinterpret our individual failures as some kind of personal inadequacy when they're really just the statistical backdrop of economic progress. The key is just sizing your bets and maintaining your endurance so that when you are right, even if it's only 10% of the time, as Warren Buffett estimated for himself, the gains are massive enough because of compounding and the power of those positive tails to offset all the necessary losses you incurred along the way.
This deep dive into the psychology of money really connects directly to the core themes of crisis and perception. It fundamentally challenges how we view structure and outcome and merit in our society.
It does. I think the book forces us to shift the focus away from just blaming high-profile failures like Richard Fuscone or Rajat Gupta as merely greedy individuals. Instead, we have to understand the systemic incentives, the amplified social comparison, the cultural drive for unlimited wealth that pushed men who already had enough to risk everything they had.
Financial behavior is shaped so much more by these uncontrollable external forces than we like to admit. The year you were born, the inflation cycles you lived through, the availability of consumer debt, and just sheer blind luck.
If you're a young male without a diploma, your experience of unemployment in 2009 was vastly different from that of a college-educated female over 45. These structural differences inform your behavior, your risk assessment, and your financial outcomes far more than just individual merit or hustle.
When we acknowledge that, we can move from just moralizing about personal financial failures to actually analyzing the systems of expectation that produce them in the first place.
It's a crucial shift in perspective.
And the illusion of predictability is so rampant because we confuse fields of precision with fields of uncertainty. We marvel at NASA's New Horizons spacecraft hitting Pluto after a 9.5-year journey with a timing prediction that was accurate to within 1 minute. Astrophysics is a field of precision. The rules are known.
But economics and investing, they are fields of uncertainty. They're driven by human feelings, by greed, fear, panic, factors that are impossible to model accurately.
But the illusion of control is so comforting that we often believe we can get that NASA-level predictability in finance. We cling to these authoritative-sounding forecasts because we're trying to scratch an emotional itch for certainty, not solve an analytical problem.
And compounding that problem is what Housel calls the seduction of pessimism. Pessimism always sounds smarter and more intellectually plausible than optimism.
Why is that?
Because, as an evolutionary shield, losses loom larger than gains in our minds. If someone predicts a huge recession, they're called insightful. If they predict slow, grinding, compounding growth, no one cares. It doesn't make the front page.
And this narrative bias causes us to miss profound progress that's happening right under our noses. For example, the age-adjusted death rate from heart disease has declined over 70% since 1965. That saves 500,000 American lives per year.
That's the equivalent of preventing a massive natural disaster, like a 9/11 event, 5 times a week, every single week. Yet this slow, compounding progress gets almost no media attention, while a sudden plane crash or an economic collapse consumes the entire news cycle. We have to learn to recognize the power of slow, long-term optimism over dramatic pessimism.
And the ultimate systemic flaw is mistaking financial outcomes for brilliant skill or merit. The success of those who survive market volatility is seen as genius timing, when it's often just the dull, non-glamorous skill of not having been wiped out by the inevitable downturns.
Longevity and endurance are the secret weapons.
The destruction we see in markets, the 33 recessions, the 99.9% failure rate of companies, is not a sign of failure. It's a necessary part of economic progress.
It's similar to how a 20-year-old is smarter than a 2-year-old, even though they've lost half of their synaptic connections during their childhood development. The destruction, the loss, was necessary for the progress, for the growth.
So the hidden merit is just sticking around for the growth phase. But when people do succeed, they often develop what Jesse Livermore called the swelled head, that massive inflation of ego and confidence that was the cause of his own ruin.
And humility, which really just means recognizing the deep and uncontrollable role of luck and risk in every single outcome, is the only defense against that behavioral flaw. It's what ensures you build that room for error, protecting you from the ruinous surprise you were too arrogant to ever imagine.
So what Morgan Housel's book really helps us see differently about money is that we've been trying to solve the wrong problem all along. Money is a behavioral and emotional problem that's masquerading as a math problem.
Hmm.
Financial goals, they're made at the dinner table. They're shaped by your personal history, your ego, your emotions, not just by clean, objective spreadsheets.
And wealth, when it's properly understood, it's not a collection of visible goods. It is an option to control your time and your freedom. It's the ability to do what you want, when you want, with who you want, for as long as you want. That control and flexibility is the highest dividend money pays, and it is entirely invisible.
Which means humility and patience matter so much more than prediction. Humility helps us avoid the swelled head and build a crucial room for error, protecting us from the inevitable, ruinous surprises the world is constantly throwing our way.
And patience, that dull skill of just enduring, allows compounding, the greatest force in finance, to work its silent, non-intuitive magic.
Let's end with a provocative question for you, the listener. It's based on a crucial psychological finding called the end of history illusion. It turns out we are terrible forecasters of our future selves. Who you are today will be drastically different from who you will be in 20 years.
So, given that your goals, your needs, and your desires will almost certainly change over time, from wanting a high-flying career to wanting flexible hours for family, to prioritizing leisure, to worrying about healthcare, how do you minimize your future regret?
House suggests avoiding the extreme ends of financial decisions. Don't live an excessively austere life now that risks your future preparedness, but absolutely do not leverage yourself to the max now because that risks a future financial wipeout.
So the question to ask yourself is, what kind of moderate annual savings, moderate free time, and moderate control over your capital do you need to give your future self permission to quit, to change direction, or to abandon past decisions without mercy? That flexibility is the real insurance against a future you simply cannot predict.
We have been exploring the psychology of money, timeless lessons on wealth, greed, and happiness by Morgan Housel.
We highly encourage you to read the book yourself, support the author, or check it out from your local library.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy systems-level analysis like this, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.